Hume's extreme brand of empiricism may have been destructive of philosophy and religion, but it was to clear the way for a brave new world. Here there would be no straitjacket of tradition. The old certainties could be questioned. Nothing was sacred any more, except the truth, and this was available to everyone through experience. Implicit in Hume's philosophy was a belief in existential self-responsibility. From here it was but a short step to a belief in progress, democracy, and science, the shibboleths of our age. Not for nothing was the first true successor to Hume both a philosopher and a physicist. Ernst Mach was born in Austria in 1838 and grew up during the grand era of German metaphysical systems. Kant, Hegel, and Marx were regarded as the philosophers of the day. Ironically, Mach is most widely remembered today for one of his comparatively minor achievements, his work in supersonics. When an object reaches the speed of sound, it breaks the sound barrier. This takes place at Mach 1, which is named after him. As a scientist, Mach had deep sympathy with Hume's empiricism and theory of knowledge. This was how science worked, or ought to work in Mach's view. Unlike almost all other philosophers, Mach knew enough about science to begin applying Hume's ideas to some effect. By the second half of the 19th century, science was going through a transcendent phase similar to philosophy. It had grown too big for its boots, and had an absurdly overblown view of its own powers, both to conquer the world and to explain it. A recurrent scientific malady which once again reached fever pitch toward the end of the following century. Science believed it could know everything. The entire universe worked according to mechanical laws which could be discovered by science. Such laws of nature had an existence of their own which could not be questioned by mere philosophy. Mach was to explode this overinflated balloon, and his arguments are recognizably Humean. The so-called laws of nature were nothing more than generalizations from innumerable particular experiences. Only such experiences existed. The generalizations were no more than man-made ideas with no independent existence of their own whatsoever. Mach's development of Hume's ideas struck a jarring note in the great scientific era of Darwin, Faraday, and Mendeleev, but Hume's ideas could well withstand such scientific giants, having been inspired by and tempered by the findings of Newton. Hume had a profound understanding of science, and his ideas remained relevant despite the previously unparalleled advances that science had made during the century between him and Mach. When Mach began applying Hume's ideas, he soon found himself questioning some of the basic assumptions of 19th century science. According to Mach, all you could say about space was the distribution and behaviour of the phenomena within it. This was what related matter throughout the universe, not the fact of it being in something called space, which couldn't be observed or even registered instrumentally by definition. In other words, there was no such thing as absolute space. It was simply a concept. Likewise, time. No one had actually measured anything called time. It was only an idea. All we experienced and could measure was one set of movements, a runner, say, against another set of movements, the controlled, standardized movements of a stopwatch. Thus, no such things as absolute time either. A few years later, Einstein would acknowledge that Mach's idea of time had prompted his thinking about relativity. But this approach to epistemology contained the seeds of its own downfall, and as we shall see, possibly even the downfall of epistemology as a philosophic enterprise. Mach also applied his Humean ideas to the atom. By the latter half of the 19th century, the concept of the atom was beginning to play a major role in both chemistry and physics. Mendeleev built his periodic table of the elements on the idea of different types of atoms. Avogadro's revolutionary hypothesis about the similar density of gases relied upon the notion of the atom. Yet no one had actually ever seen an atom, or measured one, or come up with any observational evidence whatsoever for the existence of such a thing. Science was moving beyond observation into the field of hypothesis based upon what worked as an explanation. Atoms worked as an explanation, and the notion of the atom was proving highly fruitful in further extending scientific knowledge. So what if the existence of atoms couldn't be proved? This didn't matter. Mach, and thus Hume, were wrong. Or so it would seem. Nowadays we are all convinced that there are such things as atoms. Or are we? What exactly are these things called atoms? Atoms, as conceived by late 19th century scientists, were like minuscule indestructible billiard balls. Mach contradicted this notion on Humean grounds, and he was right to do so. We now know that atoms are not minuscule indestructible billiard balls. According to modern science, they are something much more complex and ambiguous. Indeed, by the early decades of the 20th century, quantum physicists had begun to question the whole idea of picturing the atom at all. According to the great German scientist Heisenberg, he of the famous uncertainty principle, it was not possible to describe such a thing as an atom. All we could do was take observations of what happened at this physical level and record the data. Such data could be read only as a series of tables, and was not to be hung onto some picture of an atom. All such pictures were concepts, not based on any observation, which could only be misleading. Mach's approach, Hume's empiricism, appeared to have some relevance after all. The resemblance between Heisenberg's tables of data with no overall picture and Hume's simple impressions with no object or causality is uncanny. Mach's ideas were to have a profound influence on one of the major philosophical movements of the early 20th century, namely logical positivism. This was the product of a group of philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians who met regularly in the cafes of Vienna and became known as the Vienna Circle. The multidisciplinary nature of the group indicates the direction in which philosophy was now moving. The core principles of logical positivism have an unmistakably Humean ring to them. According to these, there are two types of meaningful statements. The first contains the propositions of logic and pure mathematics. These are necessarily true because they are tautologous, that is, the meaning of one concept is contained in the concept to which it refers. For example, 2 plus 2 equals 4. The concept 2 plus 2 contains the concept of 4. The second type of meaningful proposition contains facts which, unlike the previous type, refer to the empirical world. For example, it is raining. The speed of light is precisely 186,282 miles per second. We can verify these facts, or disprove them, by referring to experience, or we can test their validity by experiment. All propositions that did not fit into these two categories were deemed by the logical positivists to be metaphysical twaddle. Such propositions were neither necessary, in the logical sense, nor verifiable in any way. For example, God created the universe. Life has no meaning. Unfortunately, it was soon realized that the core principles of logical positivism also fell into this category. They were not logically necessary, nor could they be proved by experience. Despite this damning flaw, logical positivism proved a useful corrective to the inflated metaphysics of the 19th century. It attempted a scientific way of doing philosophy, and proved of immense use to scientists during the 1920s and 1930s, when the likes of Einstein and Bohr were recreating our entire universe. But with the advent of relativity and quantum theory, science itself now seemed to be progressing in an unscientific fashion. Take quantum theory, for instance, which treats light as either particles or waves. This is basically illogical. A thing cannot be two separate things at once. But as a theory, it works, and produces further fruitful knowledge. Here the theory is built upon theory, with experience, or experimentally verifiable data, as the end product. In such a situation, any philosophic theory of epistemology would seem inadequate. For the time being, it appears that science has simply hijacked epistemology. Yet, should epistemology ever return to the domain of philosophy, it will surely be on a Humean basis. From Hume's writings. The definition of impressions and ideas. All the perceptions of the human mind resolve themselves into two distinct kinds, which I shall call impressions and ideas. The differences between these consists in the degrees of force and liveliness with which they strike our mind and make their way into our thought or consciousness. Those perceptions which enter with most force and violence we may name impressions, and under this name I comprehend all our sensations, passions, and emotions as they make their first appearance in the soul. By ideas, I mean the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning, such as, for instance, are all the perceptions excited by the present discourse, excepting only those which arise from the sight and touch, and excepting the immediate pleasure or unease it may occasion. A Treatise of Human Nature, Book 1. Explaining our perceptions further. There is another division of our perceptions which it will be convenient to observe, and which extends itself both to our impressions and ideas. The division is into